Well, welcome to Knowing Your Plant's Water Needs. My name is Jonathan Manning. I'm a certified arborist. I love plants, I love the desert, and I've been growing plants in the desert for 25 years now. And in that short time, I've learned a few tricks about keeping my plants healthy and beautiful and saving some water at the same time. So those are the things that I'd like to share with you all today. Thank you for joining, and let's get started. So this chart is very readily available from your Water Services Department. It's about irrigation frequency. And there's a few details in the fine print at the bottom that I want to go over first, because it's a really good place to start, is this chart, and you can find it in most places. I just really want to point out a few things that are in the fine print. So at first it says these guidelines are for established plants, and they're saying for trees that would be 3 years of being planted and growing bigger and bigger. Shrubs 1 year. So you have to keep in mind that this chart, the frequency that it recommends to water those plants is for a bigger plant that has a lot of root system, roots that are deep to absorb water that you put down in the soil, and a big wide root system that can absorb a lot of water and hold it for a long time. So that's one thing to keep in mind. This chart here is another one that's more for plants that are newly planted. So your landscape, if it's brand new, is going to need a much different frequency of watering than that chart would recommend. So just a little detail to remember. The other one in fine print there at the bottom is drip run times are typically 2 hours or more for each watering. So what's a run time? A run time is the amount of time that your irrigation stays on while it waters, right? And the only thing that does is soak the water in deeper and deeper and deeper into the ground. And if you notice on the chart too, it recommends 24 to 36 inches deep for the water on a tree. That just is a matter of how long you run that water for. That's how deep it soaks in. So you have to remember that this chart is an average. The reason your yard may be uniquely different than what the chart would recommend for the 2-hour run time is the soil type. Everybody's soil is different, and that's why the chart doesn't always work with that 2-hour run time. In really sandy soil, really gravelly soil, I've been to places, especially in mountain areas of Phoenix, where you throw a hose on full blast on the ground and it just disappears into the gravel. It doesn't back up at all. So in soil like that, you would need a very short run time, maybe half an hour. And then on the other end of the scale is that clay soil, the clay soil that's maybe been compacted by large equipment driving over it and getting it so dense and compacted that water doesn't go through it very fast at all. In those cases, you might need a run time of 4 or 5 hours to get that water to soak in the depth that you're looking for. So that's why the run time can change different than the chart would recommend. And we'll talk much more about both of those things in a minute here. So now let's dig into the specific water needs of your landscape. This is where we go beyond the chart. The most common question about irrigation that I hear all the time is also the easiest one to answer. It's, am I watering too much or too little? So this is very easy to get out of the way right up front. If the soil never dries out between waterings, it could be too much water. Too much water hurts some plants, kills some plants that are susceptible to root rot, for example. It can make some plants yellow, but you don't have to worry about any of that. The way you know if you're watering too much is by the soil. The soil tells you that. And the soil won't be dry before the water kicks on again. So too much water can only be if the soil does not dry out between waterings. That way, if you know that the soil dries out pretty good on the surface between waterings, you can eliminate if it's too much water. I see way too many people not know if it's too much water, not enough water, so they stop watering. And then a week later, the plants are all dead because they weren't getting enough water. So we'll eliminate that right away. There's a couple slides here about too much water. This one shows a little bit of moss growing. Moss does grow here in Phoenix in places that never dry out. So if that soil were to dry out even for a minute or a day or two, it would be fine, and that moss would dry out and die and it wouldn't be there. So if it never dries out, you'll see a little bit of moss growth. That toad would also find a different place to live if it wasn't wet all the time there. This is another way to be too much water, and the plant's fine, the plant being the lawn in this case. So that lawn is getting plenty of water, the plants look fine, the lawn looks fine, nice and green, but it's been watering so long that the water has went across the sidewalk 3 blocks down in the gutter. So that's just a matter of wasting water. So remember conservation. Any water that is applied out of the reach of the plant's root system is a waste. So you want to focus, that's how we save water. That's how we keep our plants healthy and beautiful and save water, is you only put that water that they need where the roots can reach it. Any other water is a waste. So Common places where water is being wasted is, for example, the yard, your front yard, for example, when it first was installed, might have had lots of plants in it. Some of them may have died over the years. That's okay with you. You're happy with a little bit lighter, more manageable landscape. All those drip emitters for the original plants are still putting water out there if you've not gone back and capped them off. So that's one way you could be wasting water, putting water where those plants are no longer even there. Another one is obviously leaks. Leaks in polytubing or sprinkler lines, they leak when the water comes on, right? When your irrigation system comes on, they put out water, make a puddle, and then go back. That's wasting a lot of water because that water is going to be where the leak is, not where the roots are. Also, broken sprinkler heads are very common. The lawnmower knocks them off, people kick them off, or they just get old and break, and that'll shoot water up into the air like a geyser. If you're watering your lawn at midnight, you might never know that. So there's another way a lot of water gets wasted. More water than that lawn needs. Missing drip emitters, if a drip emitter that's above ground gets cut off, weed whackered off, puppy chews it off, next thing you know, you got a geyser again coming across the yard. So check the irrigation system. This is maintenance things that you can do to save a lot of water and put that water back where the plants need it. Sprinklers being out of adjustment, right? So the sprinkler's working fine, pops up fine, but it's squirting at the brick wall instead of the lawn, for example. It just takes a little twist. Excessive run time is the last one I see a lot, like that lawn in the previous slide. Your plants may be watering just way longer than they could ever use in water. The lawn is a runoff situation where it was going down the gutter, but drip you can also water too long of a run time. The roots of most trees can only reach water maybe 3 feet deep. Once you start soaking in water with a longer run time to 5, 6, 7, 8 feet deep, that's wasted water also. I would say run times of more than 4 or 5 hours are probably excessive and you'd just be wasting water. So remember conservation, remember all those different ways that you can keep up on the water system and put that water where the roots are, not where it's being wasted. Okay, back to the too much water, not enough water. The soil does dry out between waterings. You've been observant, checked that, made sure it dries out between waterings, but could the plants be suffering because they're too dry now? Too dry is much more complicated. Too much water is easy. Not enough water is a little more complicated. So to me, the best way to diagnose if your plants are not getting enough water is by listening to the signs of drought in your plants. And I have some slides here of different types of plants and how they can tell you that they need more water. None of these situations are deadly. If you're observant and watch your landscape often, at least every couple days, once a week if nothing else, you'll notice these problems before the plants actually die. You can correct the problem, get them back to healthy, but that's how you ride that line of perfect efficiency on your landscape irrigation. Then you know if you wait for a little bit of signs of drought, and then you fix the irrigation system where they're getting more water, now you've gotten to the point where they're exactly getting the amount of water they need. Not too much and not enough. So these signs of drought, these 3 citrus trees, the one on the right, I think most people would recognize as wilted, right? Wilted means that it needs water right now. You'd water it today, it would perk back up and everything would be fine. Most plants will show you, if you're observant, like if you're watching all the time, you notice a plant that's wilted, you water it, it comes back. It's not a problem either, not deadly. The one on the left is a perfectly healthy, juicy leaves, perky, full in the middle. The tree in the middle is the one that I think most people don't recognize as signs of drought, that's a little more subtle. So the tree in the middle is bald in the middle. So the oldest leaves any tree or bush has is the ones in the middle of the bush, right? They're older, they're shaded by the crown of the tree, so they're less useful to the plant. So when a plant realizes that it's not getting quite enough water for every one of those leaves it has on it, it has to decide to drop a few off. And that's a natural process. Like I say, none of this is a death sentence right away. It's a natural process. Those interior leaves turn yellow gradually over the period of a week or 2. They fall out. You'll find them all over the ground underneath it. And you'll notice that bald in the middle look with green leaves on the tips. They're not wilted, but the middle of the plant is empty, bald. So that would be a subtle sign that you're not giving quite enough water to these plants. And there's a couple of other slides kind of show the same thing. It's a hibiscus plant. The one on the right is lush, green, full. The one on the left has went through that same process of losing the interior leaves because it wasn't getting quite enough water. These 3 are desert type plants that are very common, Texas sage. The one on the left is as lush as they get. Desert plants are not quite as green and lush, but that's what they should look like when they're healthy and got plenty of water. A little bit of flowers on them. The leaves, if you were to touch them, would be plump and juicy. The one in the middle in this case is wilted, and desert plants don't usually wilt as bad as a citrus. They don't hang or dangle, but if you felt them, they would be soft and squishy and not very full of water. And from far away, I could tell in a second that one is dry because of the dull look. The color went to gray, not so green. And the one on the right is that same symptom, the subtle symptom of balding in the middle, leaves falling out, old leaves falling out because of periodic drought and coming back, and periodic drought and coming back. So same thing over and over and over. Just different plants have different types of leaves and they show it a little bit different. But hopefully that gives you some idea of trees and shrubs would show that kind of drought signs. Palms, on the other hand, also can show you that they're not getting enough water. The problem with palms, they never wilt. They go from perky green to dead, so they're hard to see the signs of wilt. But they do show the signs of those old leaves prematurely turning yellow and dying. So all palm leaves, as they get older, they turn yellow and brown on the very bottom. If those yellow and brown leaves keep going further and further and further up to where they're almost everything on the whole palm is yellow and brown, that would be signs of drought. And it's a slow, long process that you can correct at any point where you notice those leaves are turning yellow a little bit prematurely. So remember, palms can also tell you that they're needing more water. Agaves, aloes would be the same situation as this. They tell you the same thing when they need water. The one on the left is covering its new growth. And if you think about it, aloes and agaves, that new growth is like a palm. Only that center leaf that comes out of the middle is the brand new one. So in times of drought, what do? All the old leaves on the bottom, remember the old leaves are the least useful, they curl up around that center to hide it from the sun and the drought. So they protect that most important newest growth as they dry out. The color on the one on the left too is probably, before they would ever curl up over the heart like that, you would start to see that yellowing leaf that would be your first sign of they need a little more water. Agaves and aloes do need a little more water than annual rainfall here. None of them are native to this low of a desert situation, so watch them for signs of drought. Too much water can also be a problem, so remember the signs of too much water, and that's that the soil never dries out between waterings. The cactus, again with the too much water is deadly to cactus, so avoid cactus getting too much water. If I was here year round, I would cap the drip emitters on cactus. If you have your cactus watering at the same frequency as your hibiscus, the cactus are going to suffer. They can root rot, they'll fall over, it'll be a stinky mess there at the ground, and then they're dead. If they dry out to the point of the slide, see the little bit of shrivel there, the shrivel on the wrinkles on the trunk? That's perfectly normal. Cactus are made to do that. They shrink, they get watered, they puff back up. They shrink, they get watered, they puff back up. And this is like a month cycle, 2-month cycle sometimes in the winter. I have a row of this same kind of cactus, big 8 feet tall in the whole front of my yard, and I water that row of cactus 3 times a year, per year. And I only do it when I notice they're starting to shrivel like that. So that's the natural cycle of cactus. They definitely tell you that they need water by that shrivel and wrinkle. And then when you water them, it takes a week or two for them to puff back out, and they're fine, and that's the way they're made to grow. So probably no drip system on a cactus if you're around once a month or two to throw the hose on them and really deep soak them all at once. And then let that soil dry out really, really good before you do it again. The other kind of cactus would be columnar cactus, the saguaros and organ pipes and all the ones with the tubes, long tubes coming up. They have pleats in the sides, right, like an accordion. And the way those do is they swell up with water almost to be a perfect cylinder, and as they dry out, they shrink. The diameter of that tube shrinks down and the pleats get deeper, and that's a sign that they're drying out. A little bit of yellowing will also tell you the signs of drought on those kind of cactus. So watch for it. This one here in the slide is a little yellow and really, really thin pleats on those ribs. So again, they're made to do it. You water them, they take a week or two to puff back up. The opposite situation of too much water is a big problem with cactus, especially saguaros. If you ever see on the news one that has fallen over on top of somebody's car, that's usually because they've been getting so much water. They probably were watering with those hibiscus and ficus and all those other things that need a lot more water. Well, now they're so fat and so heavy, the root system can't even hold them up. So then you end up with a big problem and something like that. And they also could suffer from root rot. So in cactus, all those different plants, so trees and shrubs, agaves and aloes, cactus, they'll all tell you when they're dry. And when you notice, if you're out there once a week, noticing if they're showing these signs, you can catch that sign and increase the water a little bit and fix them without giving them too much water or not enough water. This is how we ride that line of perfect efficiency on watering. So now we've diagnosed we need a little more water to that yard, right? Definitely the plants need a little more water, and most people, you're thinking in your head, I need to water more often, but that's only one way that the plants could not be getting enough water, is the frequency. It is probably the most common, but there's 3 ways that the plant could not be getting enough water, and that's what we'll talk about now. Frequency, the first one, I think it's the most obvious. People, that's what they understand. When I tell people at the nursery, they come in and I see they come in with leaves and I say maybe it's not getting enough water, and they say it has to be getting enough water. I water every day. That's only the frequency. So there's other ways that you could not be watering enough, right? It's the depth of the water, and we've touched on it briefly in the beginning. It's the run time. How long do you water for when you do water? If you go out there and squirt them for a minute or 2 every day, it's not enough water. It's every day, so the frequency is fine, but it's not enough water to soak into the depth that's required. The third way that I think is probably the most problematic is the drip system itself is not wetting enough of the area underneath the plant when it waters. And that happens because when the baby little plant goes in your yard, when it first gets started, it gets 1 drip emitter right there. As that tree gets bigger, shrub gets bigger, it needs more gallons of water, more gallons of water. So the general rule on all these things, the whole entire ground underneath the plant should get wet when it waters, and that plant gets bigger, so that needs to get bigger too as time goes on. All that water should soak into the depth that's required, and we'll have some recommendations here in a minute. And the frequency should be when the soil surface dries out, right? You don't want it to stay wet all the time. So when the soil dries out, you can water again. When you do, the whole area under the plant should get wet, and that whole thing should soak into the right depth. That's the key to irrigation here in the Phoenix. But there's the 3 ways to not be watering enough. So we'll go into each one a little bit more detail. So the frequency, there's that chart again. And if you have an established landscape, it would be good to start with that, see how it goes, and watch for those signs of drought to adjust it in whichever way it needs to be. Remember the basic rule, you wait for the soil surface to dry out. So a little more on that. I mean, I know everybody usually has gravel in their yard, right? So kick the gravel away a little bit under the plant where the drip emitters are. Underneath the canopy of the plant, right? That's where it should be wet. Kick the gravel away. You can make a little 1-inch hole with your shoe or whatever. If it's dry right there, 1 inch down, now you can water again. You don't have to if it's a cactus or something, but you can. If it's still wet right there when you kick the gravel away, do not water again. That's the rule on that. The frequency. So other things that change the frequency of watering is these things. Temperature is obvious, I think. People realize when it's hot, you should water more often, right? That's pretty obvious. The other things that people don't really realize is wind. To a plant, wind is horrible. It's kind of the opposite. Humidity and wind, both wind feels really good to humans, dries the sweat off, cools you off. To a plant, it sucks the water out of the leaves of them and dries them out. So it's worse for a plant. When it's windy, and dry air is also worse. Again, dry air feels wonderful to humans because, again, your sweat works better. But to a plant, dry, hot winds is the worst case scenario. So you water most frequently in the times when the weather is hot and dry and windy. And if you see this chart, May and June are the peak of watering in Phoenix. And May, people think, why May? It's pretty cool still. It's only in the 90s usually. It's that hot, dry wind. Dry wind is the most important part. So if you go across this chart, you see in August where the humidity usually goes way up, your irrigation frequency can go way down. So humidity is a big factor. So this is kind of a guide here, but I would say May and June is when your frequency is going to be the highest, the most frequently. And then as the humidity comes, you can slow it down a little bit. And then obviously for the wintertime, you can really back off on the water as the temperature goes down. So remember all those things for frequency. Again, remember that a newly planted landscape needs much more frequent watering. I won't go into that much more, but you can get this chart in most places too. Even nurseries pass them out. Because when you first plant that plant in the ground, it doesn't have those roots that go deeply into the soil where they can get that water that's soaked in so deep. You want to water deeply even on a new plant so that the roots follow it down to that depth, but they're not going to get it right away, so the frequency has to be much more often until they grow their roots down into that wet soil. So remember that. Remember the next way to not be given enough water, number 2, is the depth. You're not soaking it in deep enough. So how do you soak it in deeper? It's that run time. The longer you run that water for all at once, the deeper it soaks in. It soaks in at different rates for different types of soil, remember. Sandy soil goes right in. It also comes right back out. And clay soil, it takes a long time to soak in, and it stays in for a really long time. So that changes everything too. Even go back to frequency, that clay soil needs water much less frequently, and the sandy soil will need it much more frequently. So the depth for a tree or shrub, I would say 3 feet is a good guide. Most desert shrubs that we grow, I would say, would have no trouble getting their roots to 3 feet deep. So if you want a little simpler rule, 3 feet deep for trees and shrubs. But lawns, vegetable gardens, and flower beds, petunias, whatever, vinca, things like that, would probably only need about a foot of wet soil when you water them. It's going to be more frequently, but it's also going to not take quite the depth that their roots can't reach any deeper than that. So this chart will help kind of tell you about that a little more. The depth, again with the soil, over and over, this is the biggest difference I see in yards. I've even seen yards here in Phoenix where half the backyard is heavy clay and the other half is real gravelly sand. It comes from, usually that situation is in the edges of town. If you live in a hilly desert area around, if the area around your neighborhood is hilly and desert, to make your homes, they scrape the tops off of mountains and throw them in the valleys. So you can have a solid rock corner and then a gravelly side of your yard. That causes a lot of problems with watering. So just remember the rules as far as sandy, gravelly. So if you put water on the soil and it soaks right in, you're going to need a shorter run time, but you're going to need to do it more frequently. And if you put water on your clay soil and it puddles up and runs all over the place but can't soak in very good, then you're going to need a really slow drip. Your drip emitters should be a little lower flow too. And they need to slowly soak into that soil over a really long run time, but then you're not going to water again for a really long time, because once you get it wet, it stays wet for a long time. That's why soil changes all this so much. Just remember those rules. This is a little experiment I did at home. These 2 holes were about 4 feet apart, 5 feet apart. I put a little drip emitter on each hole, let it run, and then I went digging with a wet spot out, right? Hopefully you can kind of see the dark areas, wet soil. And I dug afterward down to see how deep that water soaked in. The one on the left was a 1 gallon per hour drip emitter. The one on the right was a 4 gallon per hour drip emitter. And they both ran for 2 hours, right? So right now we're talking about the depth, how deep it soaks in. The run time being 2 hours for both holes, they both soaked in a foot. Doesn't matter what size drip emitter was on there in the same soil, the run time is what determines that depth. So that's just a perfect example of that 2 hour run time in this soil soaked in 1 foot, no matter how fast the water's coming out of the drip emitter. So we'll get back to that again in a minute, same slide, but talking about the drip emitters. But for now, the depth is completely controlled by that run time. So now the surface area, third way you could not be getting enough water is not wetting that whole area under the plant. And this is one that changes as your landscape grows. As those trees get bigger and shrubs get bigger, you need to add more drip emitters to wet the surface of the soil more. And this is kind of a little chart to show you, like on a brand new shrub, maybe 1 drip emitter, the blue spot there would be fine. As that shrub gets bigger, you'd put 2. And notice they're putting more on the drip line, they call it, the edge of the leaves, the outside edge of the tree or shrub. That's where the roots absorb the most water, not at the trunk. You know, the trunk of a big tree does not absorb any water right there where the trunk goes into the ground. Those roots are big fat roots that only carry water out from the tips where they absorb it up into the top. So remember, as you're moving adding drip emitters and moving them, you're getting them out to the edge of where now that tree or bush is. So that's an example of a brand new little plant, you know, just planted 1 drip emitter, that's where you start. As it gets bigger, it's going to need more water. So this is a pretty good example here on a tree. Those 4 wet spots you can see around the base of that tree, with drip irrigation, that's about as good as you can do to get the whole area under the tree wet. Now, the next one is that same slide again, but now we're going to talk about the drip emitters. So the left side was 1 gallon per hour. The right side was 4 gallons per hour. What did change? The width of the wet spot changed, right? So the heavier the flow of water, the wider it's going to spread out. So if you're really having trouble getting the whole area under a plant wet, You can increase the flow of the drip emitters. All the way up to adjustable ones can go up to 10 gallons an hour, 15 gallons an hour. And so the faster that water's coming out, the wider it's going to spread out in whatever kind of soil you have. If you're finding that you're not wetting the whole area under the plant, you need to add drip emitters and maybe increase the flow of them to get it to spread out. All right, so the flow of those drip emitters, that's what determines the width of the spread of the water. So this chart is, to me, it's interesting. It shows more or less what's been estimated that a plant would need in gallons of water, all in one irrigation, right? That's the amount of water you put down and that it's going to use up before it needs water again. And I like the example of a 6-foot shrub, right? If you go to shrubs, 6 foot, that's not a bad shrub, you know, a lot of yellow bells or something get that big. And 20 gallons of water is what's recommended. It's average, but still, to think about it, each drip emitter, if you have 1 gallon per hour drip emitters, you would need 20 of them to all water for a whole hour just to get one irrigation cycle on the thing. Don't overestimate the amount of gallons of water that your system's putting out there. Plants need a lot of gallons of water when they get watered, bigger plants especially, but they can absorb that water and hold it for longer. So just don't overestimate how much gallons of water. Think about it, if you were out there with 1 gallon jugs pouring 20 of them on that bush once a week. Just think about it in different ways to where there is limitations to drip irrigation, and the flow of those drip emitters is a big one. And if you have that one gallon per hour drip emitter still from the install of your landscape, it's not going to be enough for that 6 by 6 foot shrub anymore. So just remember all that. Think about it a little bit and know that you're going to have to increase the gallons of water for an older and older landscape. Okay, well, thanks for joining in. That's pretty much it. The basics of irrigation right here in the Phoenix Valley, and the tricks to keep your plants healthy and save a little water. There will be other topics available at Sustainable You. See you next time.